The courtroom smelled like old wood and fear. Helen Carter stood at the defense table with her hands folded in front of her, trying to stop them from shaking. Her coat was fraying at the cuffs. Her shoes had been resoled twice. She looked like someone who'd been carrying the world on her back for years and losing. Beside her, 7-year-old Austin sat on the bench, legs swinging because his feet didn't reach the floor. He held his dinosaur backpack tight against his chest even though school wasn't in session. Helen couldn't afford a babysitter. When she'd asked the court clerk if Austin could stay, the woman had sighed like Helen had asked her to solve world hunger. The whispers started before the prosecutor even stood up. She stole from a charity. Single mom. Always the same story. Foundation money. That's low. Helen heard every word. Austin heard them too. His grip on the backpack tightened. At the front of the room, high above everyone else, sat Judge Nicholas Ryan, tall, silver hair at the temples, a face that gave nothing away. Most people in San Mateo County knew his name, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he was a billionaire who'd walked away from a tech empire to sit on a bench and decide other people's futures. Some called him fair, others called him cold. Helen didn't know what to call him. She just knew he was about to decide whether she'd spend the next 10 years in prison. The charges were read aloud. Embezzlement, $180,000. Funds stolen from a non-profit housing trust meant for displaced families. If convicted, Helen Carter would serve up to 10 years in a state facility. If you've stayed this long, what did moments like this mean to you? And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I honestly want to see how far this story can reach. Subscribe to this channel and like the story for the next chapter, and walk with me as we continue this journey. Austin stopped swinging his legs. Helen's public defender, a tired man named Morris, who smelled like coffee and regret, leaned over and whispered, "The evidence looks bad. Real bad. I'm telling you now so you're prepared." Helen nodded. She'd heard it before. The gallery wasn't packed, but it was full enough. A few reporters, some local advocates, a handful of people who worked for the foundation Helen supposedly robbed. They sat with their arms crossed, faces hard, like they'd already written the ending to this story. Judge Ryan hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't looked at Helen once. He was watching Austin. The boy had gone very still. His dinosaur backpack sat in his lap like a shield. His eyes were wide, darting between his mother and the man in the black robe who seemed to sit above the world. The prosecutor stood. His name was Vincent Morales, and he wore a suit that cost more than Helen made in 3 months. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. The defendant, Helen Carter, was employed as a temporary bookkeeper for the San Carlos Housing Initiative. During her brief tenure, she authorized multiple unauthorized transactions totaling $180,000. These funds were redirected from their intended purpose, housing displaced families, and moved into accounts she alone controlled." Helen's jaw tightened. Morales continued, "The evidence is clear. Bank records, digital logs, her signature on every approval form. This wasn't a mistake. This was theft, calculated, deliberate, and hidden behind the facade of a struggling mother trying to get by." Gasps rippled through the room. Austin's knuckles went white around the straps of his backpack. Helen wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell them the truth, that she hadn't stolen anything, that she'd saved people, that the real criminals were sitting 3 rows behind her in pressed shirts and polished shoes. But her voice was gone. Morris touched her arm gently. "Don't react," he whispered. "Not yet." Judge Ryan leaned forward slightly. His eyes moved from Morales to Helen, then back to Austin. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not pity, not judgment, recognition, like he'd seen this story before. Morales stepped closer to the defense table. Miss Carter had every opportunity to do the right thing. Instead, she chose greed. She chose herself. And now she wants this court to believe she's the victim. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of Austin's breathing. Helen looked down at her son. His face was pale, his lips were pressed together. He was trying so hard to be brave, and in that moment, Helen knew 2 things. She was going to lose, and her son was going to watch it happen. Morales moved to the projector screen like a man who'd already won. "Let's start with the facts," he said, clicking a remote. The first slide appeared a bank transfer record dated March 14th of last year. Helen's name was highlighted in yellow. This transaction moved $22,000 from the San Carlos Housing Initiative's primary fund into a temporary holding account, Miss Carter authorized it. Helen stared at the screen. She remembered that day. Families had been evacuated from Redwood Terrace after a gas leak. They had nowhere to go. The board wouldn't approve emergency funds, so Helen had moved the money herself. She'd saved 12 families from sleeping in their cars. But the screen didn't show that. Click. Another slide. Another transfer. $18,500. Click. $31,000. Click. $27,000. Each one felt like a stone being placed on Helen's chest. Morris leaned in. "This is worse than I thought." Morales walked slowly across the room, letting the silence do the work. Over the course of 3 weeks, Miss Carter redirected nearly $180,000. Every transaction required authorization, every transaction bore her digital signature, and every transaction violated the terms of her employment and the trust placed in her by this foundation. Helen's throat burned. She wanted to speak. She wanted to explain, but the words felt too big, too desperate. The prosecutor turned to face her directly. "Miss Carter, can you deny that these are your signatures?" Helen looked at the screen. They were hers. "No," she whispered. "Can you deny that you moved these funds without board approval?" Her hands trembled. "No." "Can you deny that you acted outside your authority?" Helen's voice cracked. "I can explain. A yes or no will suffice." Helen closed her eyes. "No, I can't deny it." The gallery murmured. Someone in the back row whispered, "She just admitted it." Morales nodded, satisfied. "Your Honor, the defense may claim good intentions. They may claim desperation. But intention doesn't change the law. Miss Carter committed embezzlement. The evidence is irrefutable." Judge Ryan hadn't moved. His eyes were still on Austin. The boy sat frozen, staring at his mother like he was watching her disappear. Morris stood slowly. "Your Honor, if I may." "Not yet, Counselor," Judge Ryan said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I want to hear more." Morales smiled. He clicked to the next slide, a scanned image of Helen's employee contract. A section was highlighted. "Any unauthorized movement of funds is grounds for immediate termination and legal prosecution." "She signed this," Morales said. "She knew the rules. She broke them anyway." Helen felt herself sinking. The room was closing in. The faces in the gallery blurred together. Even Morris looked defeated. Austin tugged on her sleeve. "Mom?" he whispered. Helen looked down. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. "Are they going to take you away?" Helen's heart cracked. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've had to choose between doing what's right and doing what's legal. Maybe you've watched someone you love get crushed by a system that doesn't care about context. If you have, then you understand what Helen felt in that moment. And if this story is hitting you the way it's meant to, don't just watch it quietly. Stories like this only travel when people help carry them. Like the video so it reaches someone who needs it. Share it with that one person who still believes justice matters. And subscribe, not because it helps the channel, but because walking away now means missing the ending. Because the truth, it's just getting started." Morales returned to his table, confident. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests on the evidence. Miss Carter is guilty. The only question is sentencing." Judge Ryan finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "Mr. Morales," he said slowly, "you've presented the transactions, but you haven't presented the context." Morales blinked. "Your Honor, the dates," Judge Ryan said. "These transfers occurred over 3 weeks in March of last year, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Ryan's eyes narrowed. "The same 3 weeks Redwood Terrace was evacuated due to unsafe gas leaks." The room went still. Helen's head snapped up. Morales hesitated. "That's irrelevant, Your Honor, is it?" Judge Ryan's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade, and for the first time since the trial began, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Human. Morales recovered quickly. "Your Honor, the defendant's motivations don't change the fact that she broke the law. She had no authority to move those funds. The board exists for a reason." Judge Ryan didn't respond. He was looking at the transaction dates on the screen, his jaw tight. Morales pressed forward. "Miss Carter, you claim you were helping families, but can you prove that any of this money actually reached displaced residents?" Helen's hands clenched. "Yes, I have receipts. Invoices from the motels where families stayed. I kept everything. Receipts you could have fabricated after the fact," Morales interrupted. Your Honor, the defendant expects us to believe she's some kind of hero when the evidence clearly shows. I didn't take a single dollar for myself, Helen said, her voice finally breaking through. Not 1 cent. My son and I were living in a studio apartment with no heat. I could have used that money. God knows I needed it, but I didn't. Morales smiled thinly. So you expect this court to believe you moved nearly $200,000 without personal gain? That you're just that selfless? Helen opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. That's when the bailiff moved. He was a thick-shouldered man named Garrett, 20 years on the job, who'd seen 1,000 trials and stopped caring somewhere around trial 500. He stepped toward Austin without warning. Children aren't permitted during witness testimony, he said flatly. You need to come with me. Austin froze. Helen's head whipped around. Wait, please. Garrett reached for Austin's arm. No, Helen said, standing abruptly. He's scared. He doesn't understand what's happening. Garrett's hand closed around her wrist instead. Not rough, not violent, but firm enough to stop her from moving. Ma'am, sit down. Helen tried to pull away. You're scaring him. Sit down. The courtroom gasped. Austin's backpack hit the floor with a dull thud. And then, a small voice cut through the room like a crack of lightning. Let go of my mother, and I'll make you walk. The words hung in the air. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then someone in the gallery laughed. Not cruel, just dismissive. The kind of laugh you give when a kid says something absurd. Someone else joined in, then another. Even Morales smirked, a 7-year-old threatening a bailiff. A child with a dinosaur backpack, making promises he couldn't possibly keep. It was ridiculous. Garrett let go of Helen's wrist and looked down at Austin with something close to pity. Kid, sit down before you get your mum in more trouble. Austin's face was pale, but his eyes were fierce. You're hurting her. You're not supposed to hurt people who didn't do anything wrong. More laughter rippled through the room. Morris put his head in his hands. Morales shook his head, amused. Your Honor, perhaps we should remove the child before this circus continues. But Judge Nicholas Ryan did not laugh. He did not smile. He stood. The room went silent instantly. Ryan's height, his presence, his sheer authority, filled the space like a weight pressing down on everyone. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on the bailiff. Garrett, he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. Remove your hand from Miss Carter, now. Garrett stepped back immediately. Ryan's gaze shifted to Austin. The boy stared up at him, still trembling, still holding his ground. How old are you, son? Ryan asked quietly. 7, Austin whispered. And why did you say that? About making him walk? Austin swallowed hard. His voice shook, but he didn't look away. Because my mom doesn't lie, and because you're not supposed to hurt people who didn't do anything wrong. A murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Ryan studied the boy for a long moment. Then he turned to face the entire courtroom. Counsel, he said slowly, before we proceed further, I have questions. Morales frowned. Your Honor, questions, Ryan repeated, and I want answers before anyone leaves this room. Judge Ryan moved back to his seat, but he didn't sit. He stood behind the bench, hands resting on the wood, eyes moving between the screen, Helen, and the gallery. Mr. Morales, he said, you've presented transfers, signatures, logs, but you've conveniently left out the surrounding circumstances. Morales shifted. Your Honor, the circumstances are irrelevant to the charge. Embezzlement is embezzlement. Is it? Ryan's voice was quiet, but it carried. Let me ask you something. Were any of these funds ever recovered? Recovered? Morales blinked. I'm not sure I understand. Did any of this money return to Miss Carter's personal accounts, her savings, her checking, anywhere tied to her name? Morales hesitated. No, Your Honor. But that doesn't... So the money went somewhere else? Yes, but... Where? Morales looked at his notes, flustered. Temporary housing providers, motels, short-term rental agencies. And were any of those providers fraudulent? Were they shell companies? Did Miss Carter have any financial ties to them? No, Your Honor. But... So the money went to legitimate businesses providing housing. Ryan, let that hang in the air. During a 3-week period, when Redwood Terrace was evacuated, when families had nowhere to go, the murmurs grew louder. Morales's jaw tightened. Your Honor, the defendant did not have authorization. The board has protocols for emergency disbursements. She bypassed them. How long do those protocols take? Ryan asked. I don't know the exact timeline. Weeks, Ryan said. Minimum. I've seen these boards operate. Meetings, approvals, reviews. Meanwhile, families sleep in cars, in shelters, on the street. Helen's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. No one had. Ryan turned to her. Miss Carter, did any of those funds enter your personal accounts? No, Your Honor, Helen said, her voice shaking. Not a cent. Did you receive any payment or benefit from the housing providers you contracted? No. Did you profit in any way from these transactions? No. Ryan nodded slowly. Then he looked at Morales. So what we have here is a woman who moved money to save families during a crisis, received no personal benefit, and is now being prosecuted for it. Morales stood abruptly. Your Honor, with respect, the law doesn't allow for vigilante charity. She broke the rules. The rules? Ryan's voice hardened. Let me tell you about rules, Mr. Morales. The room held its breath. Ryan stepped out from behind the bench. He moved to the center of the courtroom, and for the first time, his composure cracked just slightly. 32 years ago, he said quietly, my mother and I were evicted from our apartment in San Jose. The landlord claimed she'd violated the lease. She hadn't. But the eviction went through anyway. We lost everything. Helen's eyes widened. We slept in a borrowed Honda Civic for 3 weeks. My mother worked 2 jobs. I was 11 years old, doing homework by streetlight. We had nowhere to go. No family. No safety net. The courtroom was completely silent now. Then someone helped us, Ryan continued. A non-profit housing coordinator named Margaret Ruiz. She moved emergency funds without board approval. She got us into temporary housing. She broke the rules to save us. Morales stood frozen. Years later, Ryan said, I found out Margaret was fired for what she did. The board called it unauthorized. They erased her approvals after the fact to protect their donors. She lost her job, her reputation, everything. Helen covered her mouth. Ryan turned back to her. Miss Carter, were your approvals erased? Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, after the families were housed. The board said I'd acted without authority, but I had approval. I had emails. They deleted them. Ryan's eyes blazed. Your Honor, I move to... You're not counsel, Your Honor, Morales interrupted desperately. You can't. I can ask questions, Ryan said coldly, and I can demand the full record. Miss Carter, do you still have those emails? I saved copies, Helen whispered, on a flash drive. My lawyer said they wouldn't matter. Morris looked up, stunned. Helen, why didn't you? Because you said it wouldn't matter. Helen's voice broke. You said I was guilty no matter what. Ryan slammed his hand on the bench. This trial is in recess. I want every email, every communication between Miss Carter and that board, and I want the Foundation's executives in this courtroom tomorrow morning. The room erupted. The courtroom emptied slowly, people whispering, confused, electrified. Helen sat at the defense table, crying into her hands while Austin held onto her arm. Morris was scrambling through his briefcase, looking for the flash drive Helen had mentioned months ago. Judge Ryan hadn't left the bench. He sat there, staring at the empty screen where Helen's transactions had been displayed, his jaw working. A clerk approached. Your Honor, the prosecution is requesting... Tell them to wait, Ryan said quietly. The clerk nodded and left. Ryan looked at Austin. The boy was still holding his mother, but his eyes were on the judge, watching, waiting. You're brave, Ryan said. Austin didn't respond. Your mother is lucky to have you. She didn't do anything wrong, Austin said, his voice small but steady. Ryan nodded. I know. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread. A billionaire judge had shut down a trial, demanded answers, gone off script. Reporters filled the back rows. Cameras waited outside. Helen sat at the defense table again, but this time Morris looked different, focused, energized. He'd spent the night reviewing Helen's flash drive. This changes everything, he told her that morning. Everything. At 9 sharp, Judge Ryan entered. Everyone stood. He sat. We're on the record. Mr. Morales, have the Foundation executives arrived? Morales stood stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Though I must object to... Noted. Bring them in. 3 people entered, 2 men in tailored suits and a woman in a cream-colored blazer. They looked calm, composed, like they'd done this before. Ryan gestured to the witness stand. Miss Patricia Donovan, you're the executive director of the San Carlos Housing Initiative. Is that correct? The woman in the blazer sat down. Yes, Your Honor. And you were the executive director in March of last year, during the Redwood Terrace evacuation? I was. Ryan pulled up a document on the screen. This is an email from Helen Carter to your office, dated March 12th. She's requesting emergency approval to move funds for temporary housing. Do you see it? Donovan barely glanced at it. Yes, and this is your response. Sent 4 hours later. Ryan read aloud. Approved pending board review. Proceed as needed. Your words, Miss Donovan? Donovan's face tightened. Yes, but so Helen Carter had approval. Conditional approval, Donovan said quickly. Pending board review. Did the board ever review it? Of course. And what was their decision? Donovan hesitated. They determined the actions were unauthorized. After the fact. Yes, but after the families were already housed, after the crisis had passed, after Miss Carter had done exactly what you told her to do. Ryan's voice was sharp now. Miss Donovan, did you delete these emails from the Foundation's server? Silence. Miss Donovan? We archived certain communications during a routine server migration. That's not what I asked. Donovan's lawyer, seated in the gallery, stood. Your Honor, my client doesn't have to. Sit down, Ryan said, not even looking at him. Miss Donovan, yes or no? Did you delete Helen Carter's approval emails? Donovan's hands gripped the armrests. We determined that her interpretation of approval was inconsistent with Foundation policy. So you erased the evidence that you'd given her permission. We clarified the record. Ryan leaned forward. You framed her. The courtroom exploded. Morales shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. What's irregular? Ryan said, his voice rising. Is prosecuting a woman for saving lives while the people who authorized her actions sit comfortably in their offices. Helen was sobbing now. Morris had his hand on her shoulder. Ryan looked at Donovan with something close to disgust. You knew families were in danger. You told Miss Carter to act. And when donors started asking questions, you threw her under the bus to protect your funding. Donovan said nothing. Ryan turned to Morales. Do you still want to proceed with this prosecution? Morales looked at Donovan. At the flash drive on the defense table, at the faces in the gallery, he sat down slowly. No, Your Honor. There's a moment in every story when you realize the villain isn't who you thought it was. Maybe you've lived that moment. Maybe you've been Helen, doing the right thing and paying the price for it. If this is hitting close to home, don't scroll away. Like the video so this truth reaches someone else. Share it with someone who still believes justice matters. And subscribe, because leaving now means missing what this story is really about. What happens next isn't just one courtroom. It's about what justice truly means. Judge Ryan stood. The charges against Helen Carter are dismissed. Immediately. And I'm ordering a full investigation into the San Carlos Housing Initiative's financial practices and communications policies. The courtroom erupted again, this time in cheers. Helen collapsed into Austin's arms, shaking, crying, free, and Judge Nicholas Ryan, billionaire, sat back down and allowed himself, for just a moment, to remember the 11-year-old boy who'd once slept in a car. The gavel came down 3 times, but the noise didn't stop. Reporters were already on their phones. The Foundation executives were being escorted out by courthouse security. Donovan's face had gone pale, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear. Helen couldn't stand. Her legs had given out the moment Ryan dismissed the charges. Austin was holding her, patting her back the way she'd patted his when he was smaller and scared. It's okay, Mom, he whispered. It's okay now. But Helen couldn't stop crying. Months of fear, shame, sleepless nights, it all came pouring out at once. Morris was grinning wider than he had in years. Helen, we need to talk about filing a civil suit, wrongful prosecution, defamation. This is later, Judge Ryan said quietly from the bench. Morris stopped mid-sentence. Ryan looked at Helen. Miss Carter, do you need a moment? Helen wiped her face with shaking hands and nodded. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Ryan's expression softened. I know the feeling. The courtroom was slowly emptying now. People were still whispering, still filming on their phones. This was going to be everywhere by noon. Ryan stood and stepped down from the bench. He moved toward Helen and Austin slowly, carefully, like approaching something fragile. Miss Carter, he said quietly. You did the right thing. I need you to know that. Helen looked up at him, eyes red. I broke the rules. You saved families. I could have waited. I could have followed protocol. And those families would have slept in cars, in shelters, on the street. Ryan's voice was steady. I know because I was one of those families once. Protocols don't keep children warm at night. People do. Austin was watching Ryan with wide eyes. Ryan knelt down to the boy's level. And you, he said, you were braver than most adults I've seen in this courtroom. Austin's lip trembled. I didn't want them to take my mum. I know. Ryan's voice was gentle. But you did something more important than that. You spoke the truth when everyone else was laughing. That takes courage most people never find. Austin looked down. I didn't make anyone walk. Ryan smiled a real smile, small but genuine. Yes, you did. You made me stand up when I should have stayed silent. That's more powerful than you know. Austin didn't understand. Not fully. But he nodded anyway. Ryan stood and turned to Morris. Make sure Miss Carter gets everything she's entitled to. Legal fees, compensation for lost wages, emotional distress, all of it. Morris nodded quickly. Absolutely, Your Honor. Ryan looked back at Helen one more time. You're not a criminal, Miss Carter. You're what the system should have been all along. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. Thank you. Ryan nodded and walked back toward his chambers. But before he left the courtroom, he paused at the door. He thought about Margaret Ruiz, the woman who'd saved him and his mother 32 years ago. The woman who'd been fired, erased, forgotten. He'd never been able to thank her. She'd died 5 years ago, alone, her reputation still stained. But maybe today, he'd honored her. Maybe that was enough. Outside the courthouse, the reporters were waiting. Helen stepped into the cold morning air with Austin holding her hand and Morris walking beside her. The cameras turned toward them like searchlights. Miss Carter, how do you feel? Are you going to sue the foundation? What do you want people to know? Helen stopped at the top of the courthouse steps. Austin squeezed her hand. She looked at the cameras, at the strangers with microphones, at the world that had called her a thief. I just want people to know, she said slowly, that doing the right thing shouldn't feel like a crime, and that when systems fail, we still have to take care of each other. Her voice was shaking, but it didn't break. I'd do it again, she said, every single time. The reporters shouted more questions, but Helen was already walking away, Austin beside her, Morris trailing behind. For the first time in months, Helen Carter walked like a free woman. Because she was. Inside his chambers, Judge Nicholas Ryan sat at his desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a faded photograph of him at 11 years old, standing next to his mother outside a small apartment building. Margaret Ruiz stood between them, smiling. Ryan traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. We got one, Margaret, he whispered. We finally got one. He placed the photo back in the drawer and closed it gently. Then he returned to his desk and began drafting the order for the investigation into the San Carlos Housing Initiative. Some battles were won in courtrooms. Others were won in the years that followed. Ryan intended to win both. 3 weeks later, the story was everywhere. National news picked it up first, then social media, then advocacy groups, legal blogs, think tanks. Everyone had an opinion about the billionaire judge who'd stopped a trial mid-prosecution and exposed a non-profit's corruption. Some called Ryan a hero. Others said he'd overstepped his authority. But no one could deny what the investigation had uncovered. The San Carlos Housing Initiative had been running the same scheme for years. Approve emergency actions, wait for the crisis to pass, erase the evidence, prosecute the workers who'd acted in good faith. 6 other cases surfaced. 6 other people who'd been fired, blacklisted, or prosecuted for doing exactly what Helen had done. The foundation's board was dissolved. Donovan resigned. Criminal charges were being considered, and Helen Carter became the face of a movement she never asked to lead. She gave interviews, spoke at panels, told her story over and over until it didn't hurt quite as much to say the words aloud. But the attention was exhausting. One evening, she sat in her small apartment, still the same studio, though Morris kept saying she'd be able to afford better soon, and stared at her phone. Messages, emails, requests. Austin was at the table doing homework, his dinosaur backpack hanging on the chair beside him. Mom, he said without looking up. Yeah, baby? Are we famous now? Helen smiled tiredly. I don't think so. People keep staring at us. I know. Austin looked up. Is that bad? Helen thought about it. I don't know yet. Her phone buzzed. Another message. This one, from an address she didn't recognize. Miss Carter, I'd like to speak with you about an opportunity. Please call when you're able. N. Ryan. Helen's heart skipped. She hadn't spoken to Judge Ryan since the trial. She'd sent him a thank you card, but she didn't know if he'd received it. She called the number. Ryan answered on the second ring. Miss Carter, thank you for calling. Of course, Your Honor. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I have a proposal, Ryan said, and I'd like to discuss it in person if you're available. They met 2 days later at a small coffee shop in downtown San Carlos. Ryan was already there when Helen arrived, sitting in a corner booth, reading a newspaper. He stood when he saw her. Miss Carter, thank you for coming. Of course. Helen sat down, nervous. What's this about? Ryan folded the newspaper and set it aside. I'm starting a housing trust. Independent, fully funded, focused on emergency support for displaced families. Helen blinked. You're what? I'm funding it personally. $5 million to start. But I need someone to run it. Someone who understands what it means to act when systems fail. Helen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ryan continued. The position is compliance director. You'd oversee emergency disbursements, ensure accountability, and make sure no one ever gets prosecuted for doing the right thing again. Helen stared at him. You want me to lead it? Yes. But I'm not qualified. I'm just a bookkeeper. You're more than that, Ryan said quietly. You're someone who put lives before rules. That's the only qualification that matters. Helen felt tears welling up again. Why are you doing this? Ryan looked out the window. Because someone did it for me once, and I never got to thank her. He looked back at Helen. So I'm thanking you instead. Helen didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. I'll do it, she whispered. Ryan smiled. Good. We start Monday. 6 months later, the Carter Housing Trust was operating in 3 counties. Helen worked out of a modest office in San Carlos, but the reach of the organization had grown faster than anyone expected. Emergency grants, rapid response housing, direct support for families in crisis. No board approval required. No bureaucracy. Just help. Austin came to the office after school sometimes. He'd sit in the corner doing homework while Helen met with families, approved disbursements, coordinated with landlords and motels. He watched his mother save people the same way she'd tried to save them before, except this time, no one called her a criminal. One afternoon, a woman named Maria came in with her 2 young daughters. They'd been evicted after Maria lost her job. No family nearby, no savings, nowhere to go. Helen listened, took notes, asked questions. Then she approved an emergency grant for 3 months of temporary housing while Maria found work. Maria cried, How do I pay you back? Helen shook her head. You don't. You just take care of your girls, that's all. Maria left with an address, a check, and hope she hadn't felt in weeks. Austin looked up from his homework. That was fast. Helen smiled. That's the point. Judge Ryan visited the office once a month. Never announced. Just showed up, walked through, asked how things were going. On one visit, Helen pulled him aside. I need to ask you something, she said. Ryan nodded. Go ahead. Why did you really do this? The trust, the funding, all of it. Ryan was quiet for a moment. When I was a kid, my mother used to tell me that the world wasn't fair, that some people got second chances and others didn't. She said the only thing that mattered was whether you'd be the kind of person who gave chances when you could. He looked at Helen. You gave people chances when it cost you everything. I'm just making sure you can keep doing it. Helen's throat tightened. I don't know how to thank you. You already have, Ryan said. Every family you help is a thank you. Back in his chambers that evening, Ryan received a call from Morris, Helen's former public defender. Judge Ryan, I thought you'd want to know. The State Bar is investigating Patricia Donovan. Criminal charges are likely. Wire fraud. Evidence tampering. The whole thing. Ryan leaned back in his chair. Good. There's more, Morris continued. 2 other non-profits have come forward. Same pattern. Authorizing emergency actions, then prosecuting staff after the fact. This could be systemic. Ryan closed his eyes. Then we keep digging. Agreed. Oh, and Judge? Helen asked me to tell you something. What's that? Morris paused. She said Margaret Ruiz would be proud. Ryan's chest tightened. He didn't respond for a long moment. "Thank you, Morris," he finally said. He hung up the phone and sat in the silence of his chambers. Outside, the sun was setting over San Carlos. The courthouse was emptying. Another day of decisions made, lives altered, fates sealed. But tonight, Ryan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about repair. 2 years later, the story was still being told. Not in courtrooms anymore, not in headlines, in living rooms, at dinner tables, in schools where teachers used it as an example of moral courage. Austin was 9 now, taller, more confident. He still carried a backpack, not the dinosaur one anymore, but he kept that one in his closet, folded carefully. Helen's trust had expanded to 7 counties, over 400 families housed, thousands of lives changed, and Helen Carter, once accused of being a thief, was now being called something else entirely. A hero. She hated the word, but she'd learned to live with it. One evening, she received an invitation, a ceremony honoring community leaders in San Mateo County. She almost declined. These events always felt too formal, too performative. But Austin convinced her to go. "You should let people say thank you, Mom," he said simply. So she went. The ceremony was held in a restored theater in downtown San Mateo. 200 people filled the seats. City council members, advocates, families Helen had helped. When her name was called, the applause was deafening. Helen walked onto the stage, blinking under the lights. A woman handed her a plaque. Helen looked down at it, reading the engraved words. Helen Carter, for courage in the face of injustice and compassion when systems failed. She stepped up to the microphone. The room went quiet. "I don't feel like a hero," Helen said, her voice shaking slightly. "I feel like someone who did what anyone should have done. I saw people suffering and I helped them. That's it." She paused. "But the reason I'm standing here isn't because of me. It's because one person believed me when no one else did." She looked into the audience. Judge Nicholas Ryan sat in the 4th row, arms crossed, watching. "He didn't have to listen," Helen continued. "He didn't have to ask questions. He could have let the system do what it always does, crush the people who don't have power. But he didn't." Her voice grew stronger. "And that's what I want people to remember. Not my story, but the choice he made, the choice we all have, to stand up when everyone else is sitting down, to speak when everyone else is silent." She looked at Austin, who sat beside Ryan, grinning. "My son taught me that," she said. "A 7-year-old boy who didn't know he couldn't change things, who didn't know the rules, said he had to stay quiet." Tears slipped down her cheeks. He spoke anyway, and it changed everything. The applause started again, but Helen raised her hand. "If there's anyone out there right now who's watching this, who's been told they're wrong for doing the right thing, who's been punished for caring too much," her voice cracked. "Don't stop, please, don't stop." She stepped back from the microphone. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Stories like this don't just happen. They happen because someone refused to look away, because someone chose courage over comfort. If this story reminded you why truth matters, why standing up matters, maybe pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. Because the people who change the world, they're the ones who refuse to stay silent, and maybe that's you. After the ceremony, Helen found Ryan outside on the theater steps. He was standing alone, looking out at the city. "You didn't have to come," Helen said. Ryan smiled. "Yes, I did." They stood in silence for a moment. "I looked her up," Helen said quietly. "Margaret Ruiz. I found her obituary. Read about what she did." Ryan nodded. "She saved a lot of people," Helen continued, "and no one remembered." "Someone does now," Ryan said. Helen looked at him. "You think she'd be proud of all this?" Ryan thought about the photograph in his drawer, the woman who'd given him a second chance when the world said he didn't deserve one. "I think," he said slowly, "she'd be grateful someone finally listened." Helen nodded. Austin ran up the steps, breathless. "Mom, they're asking if you'll take pictures with families." "Go," Ryan said, smiling. "That's the important part." Helen hesitated, then hugged him quickly. "Thank you for everything." Ryan watched her walk back inside, Austin pulling her by the hand, and for the first time in 32 years, the weight he'd been carrying felt just a little bit lighter. The Carter Housing Trust is still operating today. Helen Carter serves as its director. Austin volunteers there on weekends when he's home from college. Judge Nicholas Ryan retired from the bench 3 years ago. He now sits on the board of 5 housing non-profits across California. Patricia Donovan was convicted of wire fraud and evidence tampering. She served 14 months in federal prison. The San Carlos Housing Initiative was restructured under new leadership. Emergency disbursement protocols were rewritten, and in a small cemetery in San Jose, someone left flowers on Margaret Ruiz's grave. No note, no name, just gratitude. Because some debts can never be repaid. They can only be passed forward. Subscribe and be part of our True Echo Tales family, where every story lifts the spirit and reminds us that light always finds its way back. And if this moment moved, you share, because sometimes sharing hope is the kindest thing we can do.